Sind wir live? Okay. Then, welcome to this fourth edition of the Lakeside Talks. And I'm really happy to see so many faces, especially so many new faces here. So it's great to have like a really big audience for some really good talks. At least I hope, right? No, I'm very confident. So thank you for coming. I hope you enjoy the talks. I'm hoping you enjoy the barbecue. I know more than half of you are probably here just for the barbecue, but you have to endure. So no, jokes aside, let's have some really great talks. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Lorenz. He's a friend of mine actually, whom I studied with, and now he's working at Bitmovin, right? He's a software engineer there, and he will tell us about GitHub Actions and probably why you should or shouldn't use them. So the stage is yours, and enjoy.
Thanks, Veit. All right, so yeah, hi everyone from my side, and thanks Veit and team for having me today. Yeah, Veit already introduced myself, so I can actually skip this slide. Maybe one addition, I'm currently working on the Android Player SDK at Bitmovin, so yeah, focusing on Android currently. And yeah, today I want to talk about GitHub Actions in Actions. At Bitmovin, we recently switched our CI/CD system. And yeah, today I want to take you on this journey and tell you about what is GitHub Actions actually and how the whole migration worked out for us in the end. Yeah, for this journey, I came up with the following agenda for today. First, as mentioned, we will look at what is GitHub Actions. Afterwards, I have prepared a little live demo. Hopefully everything goes well there. Yeah, then I will quickly explain why we at Bitmovin chose GitHub Actions. And at the end, I will show you some highlights from what we implemented there. So to start, what is GitHub Actions actually? Well, it is a CI/CD platform where its main components are like workflows, events, runners, jobs, and actions. And those actions are what makes it so special in my opinion though. To define workflows and actions, GitHub Actions uses the YAML syntax. Yeah, we will see later in action. And yeah, down there I've prepared a little visualization of such a workflow where you can see all the components playing together. But now let's move on and look a bit into detail on those components. Workflows, first of all, are configurable automated processes, each of which runs one or more jobs. And those jobs can be run sequentially or in parallel. Furthermore, each workflow gets triggered by a specific activity, so-called event, and workflows are defined in a YAML file as mentioned, and one workflow per file in the .github/workflows directory of your repository. Examples for common workflows would be, I don't know, release or build and test. As just heard, an event is what triggers a workflow run, and such an event can be a push to the repo, a new issue, a new pull request, a cron task, or also a manual trigger. A workflow runs on a server, a so-called runner, or more precisely, one job of your workflow is run on a runner at a time. GitHub provides you with out-of-the-box runners, which are available of Ubuntu Linux, Microsoft Windows, and macOS. But if you find the need to build your own runner, you can do that easily. A job within your workflow defines a sequence of steps executed on the same runner. So each step is either a shell script or an action. And those steps in the job depend on each other, which makes it pretty easy to share data between them, for example. Jobs themselves don't depend on each other though, and are run in parallel unless configured otherwise. So with the things I just mentioned, recalling that image from previous things should make a little more sense now, hopefully. But now finally, let's talk about actions. An action is a reusable extension to simplify your workflow by extracting complex tasks. There are three main types of actions: Docker container actions, JavaScript actions, or composite actions. A lot of those actions can be pulled from the open source marketplace and directly used in your workflow, or you can write your own actions if you find the need to. No worries. If you find yourself writing custom actions, you can either put them in your repository, so locally, usually in a subfolder of the .github directory called actions, or you can create one repo per action and publish them to the marketplace, or use them inside your organization, for example. Now, before we actually look at actions live, I want to also talk about the three different types in a bit more detail, and starting with the Docker container action. A Docker container action can be pretty useful if you want to package the environment your action will run in. So with this, you have the benefit of the consumer of your action. The consumer of action doesn't need to know about the tools and dependencies used there. Docker container actions require a Linux operating system and are usually slower than a JavaScript action, for example, because you need to build and fire up the container. JavaScript actions can be useful to separate the action code from the actual environment the code runs in. Or if you just want to, I don't know, write pretty complex actions and don't want to mess around with all the shell scripts and stuff. So to ensure compatibility though with the GitHub's provided runners, JavaScript actions should be pure JavaScript and don't rely on any other dependencies, for example, binaries, for example. GitHub also provides you with a toolkit when developing JavaScript actions to speed up development there. And for example, you have this actions core npm package for input-output or debug messaging or variables or secrets in GitHub. Or there's also the actions/GitHub toolkit to access the actions context in your action. When writing a JavaScript action, all it basically takes is just referencing your main JS file in one of those run blocks. And don't bother about the syntax at this point. we will cover that all in the live demo. A so-called composite action is the last type of actions you can create, and its main difference to the other actions is that you have a sequence or a list of steps rather than just one single step to run or a program to execute. Also, this step section acts like the one from a workflow. So with one big difference though, or one big limitation, actions can't access secrets stored in GitHub. So if you want to access a GitHub in your composite action, you need to pass that as an input parameter to your action. A big advantage though of composite actions is that they help obviously splitting up your workflows. For example, by bundling together a bunch of run commands. Here you can see what such a composite action looks like. You just, stating that it's a composite action, then you will have such like a sequence of steps. All right, now let me switch over to the live demo I've prepared. Hopefully everything's working, right? If I find my cursor. Right. So I set up a quick repo with some workflows and actions to show. And first of all, if you look at this GitHub Actions demo workflow, we immediately see that not much is required to actually get your first workflow running. And if you look at the YAML file that specifies such a workflow, you can see that here at the top, hopefully you can see it, make this a bit bigger. There's a name, so you just specify any name for your workflow. That also can be, that can include spaces. If you just put it into semicolons or no parentheses, no, what's the, the double quotes. Down there you have on, which specifies the event that triggers your workflow. In this case, I have a workflow dispatch, which means it's a manual trigger. And down there you can then immediately start defining your jobs. In this workflow, we just have one single job, which is check the Java version. In such a job, you then would specify where it runs. So in this case, I chose a Ubuntu Linux runner from GitHub. And down there, I just used some steps. As you can see, it's pretty easy with just uses, and then I can directly use actions provided by GitHub. For example, the checkout action, which checks out the repo onto the runner to use the context of your repo, obviously. And then for showcasing, I just set up Java version, specify which version I want, and then at the end, I tell him to run like a shell command java-version. And what this looks like, you can see here. This is how workflow runs look like in GitHub Actions. So at the left, you have all your workflows specified in the repo. And if I now click at the run of the GitHub Actions demo, and zoom in a bit. Can I zoom in actually? No, I can't. No, I can't. No, let me see. So here you can see all the steps in your job actually. And as I previously mentioned, here you have the run checkout action. You can see all the output printed by GitHub Actions. And down there is my run command. And as you can see, it worked, so everything is green. And this is like what such a workflow run looks like. But to make this a bit more catchable, I prepared another workflow. This is the Greet Meetup workflow. Here you can see a difference already, which is like I have another trigger, push trigger. So whenever a file is pushed or committed to the repo, this workflow will run. And it's still a single workflow, so I will also show how you can extract this into an action. But yeah, from what I want to show here is also that, for example, I used an action from the marketplace. Credits to Julian Huber in this case. I don't know him, but he wrote a read file action. And yeah, with that, I can just read one file in my repo. And then I want to access the output defined in the action from Julian Huber. So all you just have to do is give it an ID. Then with this type of syntax, you can access the output from this run. So
okay, at least the reference back to the within the jobs.
Within the job or within the step in this case, yeah. So and also if we now quickly switch to where's the cursor? To this workflow, we can then see that, I mean, I assumed that we are 12 people or something, we are even more. So yeah, here you can then see that actually in the file guests just wrote 12 and it gets picked up by the action and printed to the console. All right, and now let me quickly switch branches to see how that would look like as an action actually. Here I have a subfolder actions and one action per folder and one file per action. And this is what it looks like as an action. The same steps from the workflow previously, but as an action. Same thing, you have a name, you can add a description. You can also see that I have like a human readable name, so to say. And then you would have two blocks you can define. One is the inputs block, and you could also define an outputs block right below. As we saw previously with the action from reading the file, there was an output defined. If I want to have my action an output as well, I could like put it here. But in this case, I'm just interested in the number of guests, so I define an input parameter called guests. Description can put required true or false, and I even can put a default value if I want to. In this case, yeah, using a composite action with just one step, but yeah, just for the sake of the demo here. And within an action, I can then access my input parameters like so. So you also escape it and then use inputs.guests, which is obviously the name of the input parameter. And if we now also quickly look at what this looks like. Here you can see I added a command update guests.txt. I actually wanted to do that live, but I'm a bit out of time already, or I'm a bit short in time. So let's see. And here you then have like the step reading the guest file again. Then I'm passing that to the action. And it's like here I put a plus before the meeting because yeah. And here's the same thing. And if we look at how the workflow looks like, so really what changed in the workflow using our action. Yeah, not much actually, but here the same, the checkout, then reading the file again. Sorry, that's the wrong workflow.
Someone not using it.
No, I'm at the, yeah, wrong branch. So here you can see what this looks like using the action. We just specify which action again with users, reference your locally stored action, and pass, so with guests you define the input parameter, same as with the previous action, and then you just use again the output from the previous action as an input for your action. All right. So now that we saw some GitHub actions in action, I want to tell you some additional reasons why we at Bitmoving chose to use or to revamp our system with GitHub actions. And first of all our code is at GitHub. So it just felt like a logical step to choose GitHub actions or their own CI/CD system for our platform. Furthermore, you can, with all the runners and jobs and the possibility to set up own runners, you theoretically can get an unlimited amount of parallel runs. Furthermore, also a nice feature is that you get detailed feedback. For example, if one of the unit tests fails within your workflow, you get the code line that potentially failed the test annotated in the output. It has a super comprehensive doc, therefore easy to learn and get started. As I mentioned already, you can easily set up your own runner. It's like 2 commands in a command line and you're ready to go basically. And last but not least, as GitHub Actions is free for open source repos, there's a broad community with repos you can explore and take examples and so on. Some highlights from what we achieved at Bitmoving from our previous CI and migrated to the GitHub Actions platform. We managed to migrate everything we had before, like linking unit testing and code coverage on each pull request. And additionally, we added instrumentation testing whenever we merge something to main or trunk. We have a fully automated release, basically just a manual trigger on the release branch with the workflow dispatch as we saw previously. And we also had nightly tests. And the impressive thing here is that all of that took less than 2 months of time besides regular sprint work. So it really, again, shows the power of GitHub Actions, in my opinion. Here I put a screenshot of our release.yaml workflow, which is like a bit more than just one job and one step. You can really do cool stuff with it, as you can see here. I cannot share any more details, unfortunately, but you get a sense. You can also see that the release, for example, we are releasing 2 versions of our player, and those 2 are running parallel in this case. Regarding actions, we wrote private custom actions at GitHub, at Bitmoving for all of the tedious tasks we had to deal with during releasing and apart from that. So, for example, for allow listing some of our test URLs on the systems and for documentation upload. And some of those actions we planned to share within the company, right? Because maybe other departments want to also upload some documentation to somewhere. And this turned out to be not that easy, unfortunately. Usually you can share private or internal actions pretty easily. That's supported by GitHub out of the box, so to say. But if you're limited to private repos based on your enterprise plan, which is the case for Bitmoving, we had to come up with a different solution. And what we did was like putting the action in a repo, in a private repo, and with the checkout action we saw previously, just basically checking out this action locally and then referencing it again. So this works pretty well. It's a bit weird, or it's a bit odd, but it works. And also another problem we faced is we did a lot of optimizations to instrumentation tests, so based also on the M1 architecture from Mac, and also for the emulator to run pretty stable, we needed some kind of, not the Linux runners because they are not powerful enough for that. And so we tried the GitHub macOS runner, which is included, and there we found it like a bit slow and buggy, unfortunately, which in the end we then bought a Mac Mini and set it up in the office, which is also pretty easy, as already mentioned. And a very important sentence on there is like with the whole GitHub Actions setup. We are like more than 10 times cheaper now compared to the previous CI/CD setup we had. So costs might also be a factor when choosing your CI/CD platform. And with that, that's actually it. So the end of my presentation here. I collected some links. Yeah, definitely check out the documentation on GitHub Actions if you're interested. And with that, thanks for your attention and happy to answer any questions if there are. Yeah, Sepp.
Do you want to tell us which CI/CD platform you used before?
I thought if I can put that on a slide, I don't know, I mean, it was Jenkins, but like a third-party hosted Jenkins, which obviously paid into the costs. But yeah, overall, it was a Jenkins setup, and it was like Jenkins can do pretty much everything, but it's not that easy to learn, and also it requires a much higher skill, I don't know, curve, so that everyone can contribute to it. So that's why we also chose GitHub Actions, because that's like developer-centric, developer-focused. So everyone in the team can just change something whenever they need it, or add something whenever it's needed.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
you said it took only 2 months. So
Yeah.
for how many people?
We are 4 people in the team, but not everyone was working on the setup. And as I said, besides sprint work, so I would say that at max there were 2 people really doing a workflow or integrating something, and overall it was really, I came up with that number actually in my head. It could be even less than 2 months. So it's like, Lucas, correct me if I'm wrong.
Maybe 1 man month.
Yeah, maybe 1 man month.
And the volume for migration, so
Sorry?
how much work was to be done?
That was a good question. That's a good question.
So it's not only the release level, there are obviously more, right?
Exactly. We do have, I think, 4 workflows now in place. The one we also using Exoplayer under the hood as a submodule, which is also not the secret. So yeah, and also releasing that submodule, our fork of it, so to say, is one workflow. Then the player release workflow. Then we have the CI workflow on pull requests. And each workflow was done by 1 person basically during those months. And nightless, yeah. Nightless, we are just running tests, no nightly builds yet, but just because we don't need them, but we could just enable it basically. Yeah.
If I get you correctly, you're using 2 types of runners. One provided by GitHub itself, and also your Mac Mini.
Exactly.
Ways to handle 2 different runners, one that you own and one that GitHub's own. Is it easy, or there are hiccups here and there?
It's actually very easy, especially the Linux runners are pretty stable and pretty nice to use. With the Mac Mini, we also don't have that many problems. The only problem we encounter from time to time is that the emulator got stuck or just hanging up on the instrumentation tests, and then we just need to reboot it basically. But you immediately see that, for example, with the nightly builds, if there are also instrumentation tests running, if those fail, you just immediately see that and can either rerun the workflow or restart the emulator, depending. But from a maintenance side, it's like really not that much that we need to do with that Mac Mini, apart from updating.
So you're emulating an iOS app in this runner then for this step, for example?
No. You need on Android, you need an Android system or an Android emulator of physical phone or physical device to actually run the instrumentation tests. And this is like, yeah, we are emulating an Android device on the macOS runner. Yeah, Giuseppe?
Have you tried also to use GitHub action for the CD part and not just for the CI to deploy applications or releases?
Yeah, I mean, we are deploying to JFrog, which is part of the release. So the release step we saw earlier, this one, the third step here basically also publishes the release to JFrog and everything. But yeah, we don't have this like continuous delivery at the moment. As I said, we just don't need it. We're releasing on a 2 weeks cadence, and this is like why we chose a manual deployment.
Okay.
Awesome.
Once again, thank you very much for your talk.
You're very much welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, my pleasure, or our pleasure actually. So we will take a 5-minute breather also to get some fresh air in and switch laptops and stuff. And rest assured, there is more beer on the way. So no need to leave because of that. But see you back in 5 minutes to the online people, and yeah, I'll usher you in once we have the new setup then. Well, thank you.
Ja. Ich habe auf die Uhr geschaut, ich war literally genau auf 10 Minuten, wo ich immer auf 10 Minuten war. Ich dachte, ich bin da viel längst, aber ich meine, ich habe schon ein paar Mal geredet.
War gut?
Danke.
Passt, ja.
Ein bisschen leiser was hinten. Also, für die Typen, ich habe es einmal probiert zu zeigen, aber ich wollte die da nicht stören, weil man hat die gehört. Okay. Das war kein Problem. Aber
ja, ich habe richtig an
das hier. Sorry, wir mussten wechseln. Ja. Ach so, ja. Gute Dinge. Brauchst du was zum Trinken? Zwischendurch oder so? Soll ich dir was schnell holen? Wasser?
Ja, genau. Ich glaube zwar nicht, aber schaut sicher nicht.
Du musst ziemlich schreien.
Ja, genau. Und das ist leider von der Akustik hinten schlecht. Das heißt,
ich habe schon gedacht, du die Introduction gemacht hast, okay, wenn ich jetzt auch so laut reden muss, dann bin ich hin.
Ja,
ich versucht, aber
ich muss ja nicht so laut reden, ich bin absichtlich lauter, damit das Ding, aber
damit die Leute hinten auch aufwachen.
Wie darf ich dich ankündigen?
Ja, also Sebastian Resch hat ja arbeitet für Has2Be.
Ja,
genau. Ist für das,
und du bist Teamlead, gell?
Ja, genau, aber Software-Ingenieur-Rechte.
Ja, passt.
Sonst kann ich die Folie aufmachen.
Da hinten.
Live-Demo war mal fast abgeschnitten mittendrin.
Das aber hat geklappt. Ich meine, ich habe dir nicht zugehört, aber hat geklappt.
Okay. Was haben wir jetzt?
Kann ich gleich
zuhören.
Jetzt gerade ist es gegangen, oder?
Also wenn du Feedback für den Talk haben willst, musst du die anderen Leute fragen. Aber ich kann dir nur über die Präsentation führen, weil ich kann dir 5 Sachen gleich. Ja.
Ist jetzt auf Englisch oder nicht?
Warte, oder?
Das kann ich nochmal ausdrücken.
Gut, haben wir Pause eingeplant. Es ist immer.
Sonst, ich meine, jetzt online, sonst könnte man einen anderen Laptop aufbauen.
Worst case. Probieren wir es. Nico, probieren wir. Du hast es da. Ja, dann steck mal den Beamer aus und nochmal ein. Ja, okay, dann liegt es nicht da dran, dann wissen wir das. Okay. Also bringt es an nichts, den anderen Laptop hinzustecken.
Scheißegal. Das ist immer die Testen.
Ja, aber die Elgato nicht Pro Dinger sind halt immer so halbgar.
Mhm.
Die sind mir so regelmäßig schon abgeschmiert.
Okay.
Also während Corona halt alles online gemacht und Events gehostet und Zeugs und immer ein Graus. Entweder du gibst Geld aus für Streaming-Hardware im Bereich von Tausenden von Euro, dann geht's. Oder du nimmst die eigentlich super funktioniert und dann halt immer wieder aus.
Das ist wahrscheinlich genau der Beamer, der was immer spinnt. Oder hast du mich noch kleines Jahr noch?
Wie wir neu starten.
Wie wir neu starten, probieren einmal, ja. Die Zeit haben wir. Also,
Das ist nervig. Innenraum, die immer super funktioniert.
irgendwas geht immer. Aber fand ich im Übrigen voll cool, dass du dich bereit erklärt hast, den Talk zu halten.
Ja, für gern. Ich wollte das schon immer auf der Meetup und ich bin dann noch nie dazu gekommen. Habe ich gedacht,
Okay, ja. Ja, der Christian war das letzte Mal eben bei uns.
Hat er schon erzählt, ja.
Den habe ich einfach zwangsrekrutiert gehabt. Und jetzt.
Ist ja das Studienkollege gewesen, oder?
Genau, ja, und Schulkollegen.
Okay. Ja, da muss er fast.
Ja, genau, da hat es keine Chance gehabt. Und so weit ist nicht.
Das stimmt, ja.
Das heißt gefahren an ein Dreiviertel oder so, oder?
Sowas, ja, 2 Stunden.
Seid mit dem Firmenauto da?
Ja, wenn die Firma Zeit ist, sowieso wurscht.
Ja. Irgendwas hat sich getan?
Christian hat erzählt, ihr habt ja quasi Konferenzen auch schon gemacht. Also 3-Tages-Events.
Ja, haben wir gemacht, das war halt vor Corona. Das war das Lakeside Hackfest. Das war so Workshop, Konferenz, Meetup, Mischung. Das war eigentlich ziemlich cool. Das Jahr trauen wir es uns noch nicht, weil das war doch größer. Also es war dann 200-300 Leute. Und halt auch Speaker von extern eingeladen und so. Und das trauen wir uns das Jahr noch nicht. Aber dann...
Warum will der?
Hey, danke, ich bin.
Du bist dahin?
Ja.
Okay. Liebe Grüße an die Babsi.
Werde ausrichten. Die freut sich, wenn ich ankomme.
Ja, deswegen.
Was hören wir jetzt?
Hexagonal Architecture.
Und ich kann dir nicht...
Trotzdem haben.
Ja.
Sonst Stream schauen.
Die machen wir nochmal.
Ja, dann hauen wir nicht. Ganz einfach. Hilft dir nichts.
Ja, sagt eh keiner außer die online.
More technical difficulties. Oh, well. Das Bier ist da, sehr gut.
Ja, zumindest das.
Das wäre Sache, wenn das ausfällt.
Ja, sonst weiß ich nicht, Whiteboard.
Laptop umdrehen. Ja.
Vorhin war noch ein paar frei, was ist
Ja, da war niemand. Also, es ist.
Ich will vorher noch nicht vorbeidrängeln, wenn da gerade mitten.
Ja, mach ich schon, ich mache mir lächerlich, das passt. Ein bisschen. Ist ja keine jetzt hochprofessionelle Konferenz, ist ein Meetup, da darf was schief gehen.
Ich habe davor noch nie was davon gehört. Das war ja so scheiße, wie formal soll das jetzt sein?
So formal.
Das ist aber vorher nachvollziehbar. Also wie viel Businessman muss das jetzt sein?
Ja, das so viel Business, wie du es haben willst. Weil jeder hat irgendeine Motivation, warum er da ist. Manchmal ist die Business-related. Das Einzige, was wir definitiv nicht wollen, ich meine, da bist du jetzt nicht in Gefahr, wir wollen keine Abwerbewerbung jetzt. Also,
wir müssen 15 Folien löschen.
Ja, genau. Ja, ich bin mir ziemlich sicher, dass Christian nicht gesagt hat, aber das ist auch warum. Also, für mich, also wir und dann so mein anderer Hut als Dynatest sponsern uns halt. Aber wir stellen nirgendwo drauf, weil das haben viele Meetups das Problem, dass halt einfach die Leute dann nur probieren.
Ja, es gibt dann oft so Pausen, wo es dann eine halbe Stunde nur.
Ja, genau, das kann man sich sparen. Sucht jeder. Jeder. Jetzt müssen wir trotzdem nochmal Kabel runter. Können wir das gleich nehmen, oder? Eigentlich. Kann man das nehmen? Achso. Du hast einen Splitter? Achso, Strom. Darf ich dir das kurz überlassen?
Schau, es geht noch mit den Passieren. Das Kabel ist gut.
Ist gut? Okay.
Jetzt liegt der Kabel.
Wie man das dann halt Also mein Challenge gewusst ist, dass der Pretext Ja, also normalerweise was machen wir jetzt Intake, Testing,
Muss ich schaffen. So, aber ich stehe. Das passt, oder? Wenn ich uns
Das passt, das.
Auflösen. Vielleicht ist das auch der Grund, warum der Beamer eigentlich ist. Okay. Da. Vielleicht geht's dann mit dem Beamer, oder lassen wir das jetzt?
Was machst du jetzt?
Okay. Ja. Jetzt kann man im Fernseher ein bisschen weiter drücken, dass ich danach sehe, was hinter mir ist. Ja, nicht, dass auf einmal Pornhub offen ist oder so.
Ja, aber du müsstest ja zugeben, dass du dann PHP machst. Also.
Bad News. Bad News.
Ja, passt. Okay. Bist du soweit oder? Ja.
Ah, wait a second.
Wobei es
Murphy's Law.
Nee, die war's nicht mich machen lassen, das funktioniert nicht. Aber wenn es 4 Lichtschalter gibt. Ja, gut. Okay. Schau mal, ob man hier einen Hintergrund hat. Weiß ich nicht, gell? Weiß ich nicht.
Was? Nein, Rechtschreibung.
Siehst du? Es tut mir wirklich leid, das ist mein absolut schlechtestes. Okay. Then, welcome back to all of you. As you see, we have a slight change in setup because Murphy's Law and also tech stuff, you know, kind of doesn't work sometimes. But anyhow, it's my pleasure to introduce Sebastian Reschreiter, and I totally remembered the name now. He's a software engineer at Has2Be, and I have to say it's really awesome that 4 people, I think, from Has2Be are here today, 5 even, 5. Because they actually traveled all the way from Radstadt, which is not even Carinthia. So for this setup, I'm really happy to say that we have people from Salzburg, from Radstadt here as well. And he will tell you about hexagonal architecture, and I'll just hand over the word.
Thank you. Okay, very cool, very happy to be here. It's also my first time, but I do not have the good places in the back. I have to stand in the front and talk to you. Hopefully it's going to be a good talk. Today I'm talking about hexagonal architecture. Maybe some people already know about it. I think the more modern name is now ports and adapters, but I think hexagonal sounds more spacey, so I always stick to that one. So yeah, I was already introduced, so thanks for having me. I'm Sebastian Reschreiter. I also had to memorize this name because I got married recently and I changed my last name, so everything's fine. So, okay, so what are we talking about? Before I go into hexagonal architecture, I want to make you understand why you might need something else than the model view controller that we all love and know. So, if you haven't seen this before, this is model view controller, like all the big frameworks using this pattern. We are having models which should handle all our business logic. They are also, most of the time, object relational mappers, so they are also infrastructure. So storing, persisting to the database, everything here in the model. Then we have the controller. This is the entry point for our application. So they're handling HTTP requests, and it will most of the time respond with a view, so either a JSON view or a HTML view or something in between. You never know. Okay, so why might this be not sufficient? So if we're having a small REST service, this might be okay. You have a very specified entities, you can call them, you can update them, and get the JSON object in return. But once you have something bigger and you're living, for example, in a microservice ecosystem, then you maybe want to design it in a different way. Maybe you do not want to give full control to the client to define how the object should look like, and then just posting it to the service back, but rather having the control in the application, requesting certain things to do. For example, register user and then specifying something to actually register the user. And then you're thinking like, okay, I don't actually just want to do it via HTTP. I also want to have, for some reason, a SOAP call. And I also want to do it via the CLI. And I also want to test it. And then this can get tricky. And maybe you also know this. First, you start copying the stuff into any commands. Then you start copying into a SOAP client. And then you're duplicating all your code. But actually, you just want to call the same thing multiple times from different places. So this is the point where you could say, okay, maybe pure MVC is not enough and we should go for something else. So let's have a look at the creator of the hexagonal architecture, which is Alistair Cockburn. So cool name. But his ideas are great, so that's nice. So what he says is actually what I tried to explain right now. He wants something that can be equally driven by either a user, a program, an automated test, or a batch script, for example, if you want to migrate data. And this thing that you try to access should be testable or developed in separate environments. So that you do not have to take care like, okay, this will be stored on AWS, so therefore I have to set this configuration. You want to have something that you can develop locally, deploy it somewhere, and using different databases, for example. If you know Von Vernon, this is a pretty cool guy. He explained to me how domain-driven design works. So if you haven't heard about that, it would take 1 hour to just explain what domain-driven design means, so I would stop here and just go for the hexagonal architecture part. So what he says is one of the biggest benefits of this architecture is that you can delay decisions as far to the back as possible. And why do we want to have this? We're starting a new project in a new domain, so an area that we do not know yet. So we try to figure things out. And what we want to concentrate on is our business logic, deciding which actions to take, how to structure our models, things like that. And we do not want to start, as always, like with a new service, so the database needs to look like this. I want a MySQL database or a MongoDB database. Sometimes you don't even know which database you want to use. So using this architecture, you can push this decision way to the back, saying, okay, let's refactor the models, and at some point you say, okay, MySQL is perfect for this. Right, okay, so let's get started with the actual architecture. This is what we call layered architecture. So we have different layers for different reasons, and very often they are just called from top to bottom. So what is allowed is calling from presentation to application, application domain, domain infrastructure, but you could also call from presentation to domain. So top to bottom, everything is allowed. And this has great benefits. That's the reason why some developers already adapted it. And Mr. Cockburn said, okay, no, that's not sufficient. We want to have something more. So what he did, first let's explain something different. So the core, what means this? The presentation and the infrastructure is actually just an implementation detail, to be fair. So if this is a Vue.js frontend, or if this is a microservice from a different company, we do not care. It's implementation detail. If they call us with REST or with SOAP or with an event, implementation detail. We do not care about it from a business perspective. The same thing goes for the other end. So if we're saying we're using MySQL, MongoDB, time series DB, we do not care. This is just an implementation detail. We care about this part. This is the part where the product owner talks to us and saying like, we want to have this feature or that feature. So this is the core. This is why we built the service. The rest is just so that it works. So what we want to have is the controller should lie in the center. So anything should be able to call our application, but the domain or the application should decide how the infrastructure should look like. So telling what we want to do, but we will come to that later on. To make these things a little bit easier, I will turn it around. You will see why I do crazy stuff like this. So here I'm explaining like we have this driving part, which tells the application to do things, and on the other side we have the infrastructure part, which is driven all the time. Like persist this, call this, do that. Hexagonal architecture. You get it? So what does this mean now? Like they used a hexagon, we could have gone for an octagon, whatever gun. The reason why we have this presentation is because we want to visualize that we have different use cases from different clients, and we have in the back different infrastructures that are used. So this is kind of the shape that our service will have. And now, to make things more beautiful, ta-da, this is, if you Google hexagonal architectures, will look more like this. So this was our cool transition from layered architecture to hexagonal. And now we're at that point where we want to be. So we want to have our different drivers that are the adapters, and we have certain ports on our service. So this is our core. Inside of it, there is our business logic living, our models, what we want to do. And here we have some import ports that could be services, use cases, however you want to call it or structure it. The important part is they are doing something certain and they need to be called by those drivers. On the other side, we have the driven parts, so the driven adapters. Those can be mappings to MongoDB, mappings to MySQL DB, mappings to different services, mappings to REST calls, whatever you can think of. So let's get a little bit more concrete that we can more easily understand that. Okay, I already said that, different use cases, and in the back, calling different services or any persistence layer, for example, or sending emails, right? I said easily swappable, so you can put a GUI with it, normally RESTful, SOAP event tests. That's the cool thing, it's easily testable. I don't know if you have ever worked with CodeIgniter with the version 2, which doesn't support testing. It's really awful because you have to have a live running version and a test version that is doing actual HTTP calls to do full integration tests. Awful. With that pattern, you do not care about it because how the controller looks doesn't matter. You just call the actual service that should do something. On the other side, we have the driven part, MySQL, MongoDB, in-memory, microservice, service mock, whatever. We do not care. So we can focus on the center. Okay, so now we can put it in. This is now the same, always the same thing. So this is hopefully production where you put a real GUI and put a MySQL database in the back, and you also want to call another service. So this could be another microservice or a module in the same monolith, doesn't really matter. And you can swap it out. So you figured out, okay, my MySQL relational database doesn't fit my purpose, so let's switch it out for a MongoDB. And the cool part is you do not have to go to every place and rip it out and rethink everything because it's technically, you have to do this query here and find it like that. You're just using an abstraction and then you say, okay, this very specific part about MongoDB, we switch it, plug it in, and it runs again. Okay, and then another cool thing, you want to do tests on it, put the test stuff in it. You have a service mock, which always responds with the same data. You have in-memory database, so you really have unit tests, and it's called by some test cases. So let's go a little bit more into detail, because the last time I saw an explanation of this, I was like, okay, what's this adapter stuff? How could this look like? So now I'm quickly going into details about how they look and a quick PHP example, and then we're done. So yeah, so this is how it could look like. So in the MVC, we always have this controller as entry point, but we said, oh, okay, maybe we want to have a console command as entry point. So this way, we need some separation, and this separation can be achieved by a use case class, for example. Just a class that's called use case register user, and it only has a perform method. And in the controller, you can then just call this class perform, done. Then you can easily also call it here or call it here, however you want. So in code, how would it look like? So here, for example, we have a Laravel controller. That's also the neat part. We have to do some validation in a controller. It looks like this. You validate it and set it to required. You could also put like, it's an email, whatever. Here I'm using very specific classes to describe my domain. And then I'm just calling my user service, which has a register method. So this is the port, and the controller is the adapter. Just put it in there. And then we get the DTO in this case, and we respond it in JSON format. Okay. What is if we want to have a command? Different validation. I specify those as required parameters, so it's not necessary here. Then I'm just saying, okay, give it in those classes, put it into the service, which was injected by a dependency injection. We get the DTO, we only print the ID, done. So different representation for a different use case, but it's the same use case. And the last part, we love to write tests, and easy tests and clean tests. Looks like an easy test, I would say. You can set the service up in the before method. You have your fixtures, or you could use factories or whatever. Put it into the use case, and then assert if the DTO looks like you expect it to. We never call the controller. Okay, now the other side. So it kind of works the same way, but we said we want to have the control in the domain. So how do we achieve this, or in the application? By defining a repository. And we count this repository to be part of our domain. We describe what we expect some database to do. So we describe this interface. It will be implemented by a concrete MySQL repository, Mongo repository, or time series database. You could even have a different service that is having a RESTful API and define it as a repository. You're just doing a call against the service instead of against the database. How might this look like? So we want to register user again. We want to get a user by an ID. So people from Java already know this pattern. We want okay, add user. Ooh, that's not true. That should be deleted. But persist is another thing. And then we just implement it. No, here we are using it. So that's the cool part. We do not care about the database we said before, right? So we just said, I want to get the user and I want to be able to persist it, but how, we do not care. So now here we have the interface. The ID tells us which methods exist, but we didn't implement anything yet. So what we can do is, we implement it against something. You can run the unit test, it will pass. And then, I mean, here, the use case has a lot of stuff to do. Like we are checking if the user already exists, and otherwise we throw an exception. The actual registering, which is part of the model, where we're actually doing something concrete. And then we're doing all the other stuff that we need to tell the whole application or the whole ecosystem. Like persisting the stuff, publishing some events on an event bus, and then returning the detail. And here, okay, let's write some tests. We have a mock implementation. So here, this is in memory, it's just an array. If we want to find a user, we will search in the array. If we want to store something, we put it in the array, no database. If we want to deploy it, we write an adapter for MySQL. You could use any framework inside of this. In this case, this is Doctrine. So we just inject Doctrine. This implements a repository, fun fact. And then you can just say, okay, MySQL database, it's stored like this. And we want to search it by the ID. And that's all hidden behind this repository. So you can structure your database however you want and retrieve it how your product owner would tell you to. Like, can you figure out if this user already exists and can you store it later on or persist it? Or at some point you figured out, okay, maybe this thing about the user needs to be part of another domain and another microservice. You do not have to refactor everything. You will just replace this user repository part and call another microservice with it. You never touched something in the core. The core is always the same. Yeah. So how would this look like in a schematic way? We have our service A, service B. Both services are connected to an interface. This is another API for a public API for our customers with different namings so that they understand what we try to achieve here. And those two are connected via API. Then we figured out, fuck, we're getting more and more requests and we have to always call here, create this, create this, create this, create this, and then something fails. So we want to get asynchronous. Swap it out with an event bus, it's asynchronous. It's not always that easy, but you have to touch way less parts. And so you're creating more and more services. So at some point you just stack them together and you already have an architecture that's easily to build together like Legos. And that's it. Thank you. So if you have any questions, just feel free to ask me now or later on with a beer. I like beer.
Do you have any good recommendation for evolving these interfaces? Because I would expect that tomorrow I want to have a new method added to that interface. How can I version or make it easier to swap from version 1 to version 2?
Yeah, if you really need to swap the version, then there's no way around it. You have to break the version and do something else. I mean, extending is super easy. what I would recommend is that you put a lot of effort in strategic decision making, try to figure out how things belong together, and then you have some reasoning how to go forward. So sometimes this can even be a good part when you say, okay, the interface breaks completely, that this is a sign that maybe you didn't understand fully how your domain is structured and you need to break it apart or something like that. But so to be honest, in production, I use this architecture only in one service right now. And this is running for half a year. And we haven't run into that specific issue yet. But it works quite well. And we even implemented this repository pattern for calling other services, actually Christian's service, and it's working really, really nice, because another benefit is that you can actually split one story onto different developers. So I have a lot of junior developers in my team, and the ones can build the actual business logic while the others implement the API. That's really neat.
So what you're saying is you want to make sure that you can swap out Christian services.
Yes, yes. Like,
you know my code, right?
Yeah.
Are there any frameworks that really enforce this architecture yet? Or is this more like we do it like this, please stick to our guidelines, kind of thing?
Yeah, I know that there is a Ruby gem, for example, that you could install, but this is more like a thing to follow, or how you think about it, because it's also depending a lot on which language you're using. I mean, in PHP and Java you have interfaces to do this. In Python you would probably go more for duck typing, to say like you specify something that looks like this, and then if it works, it works. You know, Python stuff. That's kind of also the same for Ruby. Ruby also has no interfaces as far as I know, but I haven't written Ruby for a long time. So yeah, I think the important thing about this architecture is to really understand why you're doing it, because once you understand what those adapters do, then you can actually move the logic there to do it. Because what I figured out with my junior developers is that they sometimes just try to create an interface for something, and then they're just explaining in the interface very technical stuff, like store it in my MySQL database, like not really, but coming from a very technical point. So this is all about how you approach your service, thinking about what needs to be done from the business side, and then it's working perfectly. Yes.
More basic question: you had these use cases like register user. Are they part of the business logic, or where are they actually?
Yeah. So if we jump to that example, yes, here. So this is going to be a little bit more complicated. I recommend you digging into domain-driven design. This is all about thinking about those parts. This is application logic. So what it describes is it tells the machine how to do certain stuff so that your business works. So getting data from a database is not something that your product owner would tell you to do. He just says, yeah, validate this part. The domain layer or business layer should purely live in your models. Like what you very often see with object relational mappers is that you have a user and then you set this, set that, set this, and then get this, and then you do 20 conditions, and then you do this. Nobody understands what this means. In domain-driven design, you would go more for the language and say, here, this is a factory method. We are creating a new user, but you cannot see the new keyword because we're telling the user to be registered. And inside of this, there could be 15 setters. But in your application layer, you do not want to have that. And also application layer, calling the repository, telling a database or a service to do something. Publishing events on an event bus is also something you tell the application to do. So that's kind of the separation. Sometimes there are like more detailed differences, like when you have to connect two services together to get a business action, thinking of ATMs. So like the ATM is only allowed to do something if this and that condition applies, but this is another service, then you would group this in a business service, but this would go too far. So this is kind of the easy story.
One follow-up question, if I understood you correctly, if you would have different adapters, you would duplicate the validation in that case, right? Or you would need to duplicate that validation.
Yes, yeah, actually not really. So this is all about user experience, to be honest. The validation kind of happens by telling it to pass those 3 objects, and you can only create an instance if they are valid. So it's owned by those models. So we put in an email, it doesn't look like an email, it doesn't work. So telling a controller to check if this is correct only speeds it up and tells the user in a better format that it doesn't work.
Okay. Then thank you very much for your talk. If there's more questions, I'm sure you stick around for a little bit for the barbecue, so sure. You can happily ask some questions. We will have another very short break in order to set up for the next talk. And after that, then there will be barbecue. So.
Sometimes it's really annoying. Best for the guys.
WLAN?
Ja.
Lakeside-Spitz?
Ja. Brauchst du Passwort?
Nico, Passwort. Warte, da steht eins.
So, never mind.
Sollte das nach der anderen Seite.
Hast du ein Ding oder braucht man einen Adapter?
Ich habe HDMI.
Ja, wunderbar.
Natürlich. Das Einzige, was das Teil noch kann, HDMI und USB-C.
Ja.
Oh.
Aber der Auflösung gelangt.
Der hat mehr Auflösung geändert. Weißt du zufällig, wie das bei Apple geht?
Boah, jo.
Schauen wir mal. Oder ich google das schnell.
Zeit haben wir ja wohl.
Benutzt das Teil jetzt nämlich noch nicht allzu lang.
Ach, okay, dann. Weißt du, wie man bei Apple die Auflösung ändert?
Ich habe keine Ahnung.
Ich google es gerade.
Das ist ein kleiner Mauszeiger.
No, das ist nur für ein File-Dings. Ich werde es doch einmal.
Windows P.
Normalerweise.
Aber dafür haben wir die Pause.
So. Apple-Symbol, Systemeinstellungen, Display.
Such mal die Windows-Taste. Ich finde es ja nicht.
Oh, so viele Fenster auf einmal gleichzeitig offen. Zach. Schreibtisch.
Was suchen wir?
Display oder irgendwas eben da. Displays. So, was für Auflösung?
Einfach am Ober dran.
Ja.
Bitte mal.
Du hast ja 2 da gehabt. Du hast hier schon den MacBook, also integriertes Retina und dann das
Integrierte wie es sein.
Wenn ich auf das andere gehen und das Ding auf einmal auf 4K.
Ja, okay, kannst du jetzt irgendwie hier runter dran?
Kannst du es skaliert machen?
Check ihn nochmal aus und nochmal rein.
Das ist eine gute Idee.
Habe ich schon mal erwähnt, dass ich Macs habe?
Ja.
bis jetzt hat es immer funktioniert, muss ich sagen. Was mich selber wundert, weil ich war so anti-Apple.
Nicht unterstützter Modus. Auflösung nicht unterstützt.
Die Auflösung ist zu hoch. Ja,
Die kleinere wollen
Kannst du,
dann
ja,
andere.
ja, aber
Ich kann meine Tiefe noch nehmen, aber
kannst du tatsächlich Auflösung verändern?
Gibt da noch irgendwas anderes? Skaliert und wähle eine der Optionen.
Skaliert, ja, da. Skaliert.
Ja.
Und jetzt, du hast da unten. Runter. Nein. Kannst du nicht scrollen? Na?
Wo?
Das ist okay, ja.
Das ist alles.
Standard?
Das sind verschiedene.
Ja, nein, die brauchen wir nicht. 1920.
Viele?
Jetzt nimmst du den anderen Bildschirm noch und machst das da. Genau.
War noch auf dem du geguckt hast?
So grafisch.
Was brauchst du?
Ich habe keine Ahnung.
Nein, kann man das jetzt auf einem anderen Rechner präsentieren?
Ich habe nur Stuff vorinstalliert.
Okay. Was wir nochmal probieren können, ist über den Beamer fahren.
Das geht vielleicht.
Der Beamer ist alt, aber der Fernseher ist noch ein Fernseher.
Ja, alt ist gut, weil alt ist, in der Uni ist auch ewig alt, das hat funktioniert. Das ist der integrierte.
Ja?
Draußen geht es nicht so sehr, dass die Kerzen, die das Essen warm halten sollen, einfach ausgeblasen werden wieder. Das heißt, das Essen ist direkt das kann ein bisschen länger dauern dementsprechend. Aber es ist dann direkt Kalkulation, heißt es dann hinten nach dem Tag announced.
Und ich glaube, die Leute checken es dann schon.
Du musst ja irgendwie die Auflösung selber probieren können, oder?
Apple just works. Ich schau mal, ob irgendjemand.
Die Auflösung ist ja nicht besser.
Jetzt habe ich da nicht mehr Stuff zum Einstellen. Ich habe jetzt nicht mal mehr eine Maus.
Boah, dieses.
Ich habe da noch nie so einen Schiss gehabt, muss ich sagen. Das ist gerade sehr.
Ist das auf Scale denkst, ja.
Ja. Hast du auch ein MacBook?
Ja.
Okay.
Deswegen habe ich mir gedacht, probiert das am Hinter auf Standard für Display. Was du unten nicht umstellen?
Weil ich da jetzt ein Problem, dass mir da alles ausschaut, sobald ich das Teil ausstecke. Ich weiß nicht, wie ich das zusammengekriegt habe. Kann ich das zurücksetzen oder so?
Standard für Display?
Und dann da Hauptbildschirm,
Genau.
Das war's nämlich.
Genau.
Wenn ich den jetzt einstecke,
Das jetzt gehen. Und der hat
nichts mehr ist da.
das kann jetzt
Ich habe gar nichts mehr zu tun. Das ist überhaupt kein UI.
hat er ein Display erkannt. Ja, er ist ja draußen.
Ja, USB-C auf HDMI.
Ich hab's nicht an Mac-Charakter.
Das klingt nach was, das Apple ist.
Jetzt geht's ja.
So. Apple. Okay. Alter.
Okay. Then welcome back to our third talk today. And I'm happy to announce Manuel Rasinger. And this time I had a look at the name earlier because also this name recently changed. So congratulations.
Thank you.
When I put up the announcement on Meetup, it was still the correct name there. So don't be confused. It's the same person still. He's freelancing and he's going to tell us about Flutter and why you probably should use it.
Sure. So thank you for the introduction and welcome to my talk. So the first two talks were about CI/CD. So I came a bit late, so I thought it was about CI/CD. And the second one was about backend. So I think it's a nice addition because now we are talking frontend. So a lot of people don't know about Flutter, and that's a shame, honestly, because it's a very great technology, and I learned to love it over the past, I think, 6 years now. So what's the problem? If you want to develop for a specific platform, you have to learn a very specific tech. So like Apple Native, you need something like Swift or Objective-C. If you want to develop for Android, you need, I don't know, Java or Kotlin. If you want to do web, you need a whole bunch of different stuff. If you do what, you get the idea. All of these can be replaced by Flutter. So, I mean, of course, I have to say it's a trade-off because the more a single tool can, the worse it is in the specifics. But up to now, I didn't run into any too large of obstacles. So what makes Flutter awesome? So the first thing is the programming language is Dart, which also very few people know about, which is also a shame. Dart is basically the love child between C#, a bit of Python, the good stuff of Python, like named arguments, a bit of Java, and it really feels very good because it does a lot of things to you, which we can see a bit later in the live demo. The main point that sold Dart to me was that you have one code base, and with the push of a button, you deploy everywhere. So like Windows, web, Android, you name it. A lot of UI components come pre-installed. That means I, as a developer, am not very good at design, and most of my applications looked like not very good. But Flutter natively implements many material or Cupertino design elements, so you just stack them together and you get something half decent at the end of it. It's very beginner friendly. The Flutter community is great. Even the Flutter developers themselves post weekly videos with the newest thing of the day that you should definitely use in Flutter. And you can get very fast, you get very far very fast. So with minimal setup time, if you know stuff like Java, you will have fast success in Flutter also, because a lot of the syntax stuff you already know because it's the same in basically any programming language that exists. And it's actually not that hard, and the support and documentation is great. If there is something that you need to have in your app, and it's a bit more complicated, then it probably already exists in one of the over 24,000 community packages. and you just have to pull it into your repo with a very nice dependency system. So stuff like writing into a database, querying a backend for some data, there is already packages that do it, and in a very few, very specific cases, I occurred the problem that I don't have the right package to do. So one thing, there's a few dynatrace guys here. One thing I wanted to accomplish in my latest project was a neat networking graph, and I couldn't do it in Flutter because Flutter didn't have a nice library for it. So I chose another programming language. You have extensive testing capabilities, so Flutter allows you to do your regular old unit tests that you already know and love, but you can also do front-end tests. So you can look for buttons with the testing API, you can simulate clicks on those buttons, you can mock services to the front end that you can only test the front end. You can check if stuff is there after other stuff was clicked to really test the front-end business logic. And you have all the neat extensions like code coverage, then evolving testing coverage over time. Yes, so Flutter testing is a thing because it wasn't until I think a year ago where it really got popular, so I think I should mention it. You can even develop games in Flutter. There is a game engine called Flame, but I saw the latest Flutter 3 demo, and the first two things they mentioned that's cool about this game engine is that you can do monetization and apps and ads. So I don't think the game engine is all that great if the biggest two features of it are ads and monetization. And under the hood, Flutter is a single-threaded event-based system, so you have basically one thread that does all the work. You have an event loop that always checks for button clicks and stuff like that. And if you want to do something asynchronously, then time between these events where basically nothing is really running is used for that purposes. You can do multiple threads if you really need or want to, but these are very limited because, for example, stuff like native code calls, which you can do in Flutter, are not possible at the moment. And there is an open GitHub issue since 2017 for that. So how to really start at Flutter? The most important thing to learn about Flutter is that everything is a widget. Everything you see on the screen is a widget, be it a panel, an image, a text, an animation where a stickman jumps over a fire. Everything is a widget that is visible on the screen. And these widgets are composed together to form a tree. And this is very similar to your standard web thing where your elements get nested together in the DOM. So what exactly is a widget? There is two main types of widgets that need to be distinguished. One is the stateless widget. As the name suggests, it does not hold any internal state, which makes it more efficient to render on the screen because it does not need to get rebuilt every time some state in this widget changes. Examples for this are an image you want to display because it's your app's logo and it looks nice in your app's app. Yes. This image is a stateless widget because it gets the URL passed in, the image is rendered, and even if some other part of the app changes, the image does not get rebuilt because nothing changed in the image itself. The counterpart to this is the so-called stateful widget, which is a widget where you have some internal states, as you might have guessed. This can include, for example, if you have a form and this form gets filled out, the intermediate text is stored in the widget state. So all the text that it's entered, if it's an error or not, the Flutter default app, as we will see later, is a counting thingy where you can count up. The number on this counter is part of this internal state and is stored in the stateful widget. The stateful widget as a class provides a method called setState. And if you call setState, you basically tell Flutter, please redraw that widget for me, something changed, and I want to see it actually on there. And the whole subtree will be checked for things that also changed as a dependency to this change, and this subtree will rebuild. So yes, we already covered that. So to the stateful widgets, example of that would be, for example, if you have a toggle, you have your nice interface and you have many items laid out, and if you have a row of toggles, then basically these toggles will be also, for example, modeled with a number of Boolean parameters, and whenever you click a button, you say set state, update this Boolean variable, and the UI will update based on this Boolean update. So they will see, I do not want to see pictures of my mom anymore, and no pictures of my mom will be displayed. So how to actually start, because all of that stuff was pretty boring. It's how does Flutter work and all that stuff that's not actually very interesting. So how do I get right into it and how do I actually start working? So first things first, you have to install Flutter and platform dependencies. Because if you want to develop for Android, you still need the Android SDK. So keep that in mind when you start out. So you have to install Android Studio, the suggested plugins for Flutter, which are namely Dart and Flutter. And then you have to install the Flutter binaries themselves, because they will then hook right into Android Studio itself and use these if you want to build for Android. Same thing for Apple. You still need, sadly, an Apple device to build for Apple. And there Flutter will automatically detect any existing Xcode installation. As you can see on the screenshot on the right, it detected my default profile, which still has my wrong last name in it, that I use to sign apps and upload them to the App Store. So Flutter natively ties in into all these tools. If you have Flutter installed and added to your path and all that other stuff your operating system demands of you, you can use Flutter create, and it will build the default app for you. So the default app, as we will see shortly, is this counter thingy, and it will set up everything that you need, and you can start working almost instantaneously. And do the first things in Flutter, which is to remove annoying comments and delete this sample app. But everything else is done for you. So that's the app, which we will see shortly. It's, you have a number, you have a text, you have an object in the right at the top, which is I think it's called app bar, top app bar, something like that. And we have a floating action button, which we can tap to increase the number we see on the screen. It's a lot of functionality, it's a lot of code, but I think we will make it through it. The very cool thing is Flutter needs a few things to really draw nice apps. And the default app already includes them, so you get a hint on how to use them. Namely, you need one app that wraps your whole app. In that case, it's the material app, which presets some stuff like font size, font colors to a very specific style. In our case, to comply with the material standard. And you need a scaffold, because even if you use material app, you can still implement your own style. So if you would just use material app as your top element and start working on there, everything would look ugly, because the text gets as a default a very error message style, because it's basically an error. That's where the scaffold comes into play. The scaffold sets so the scaffold reads what kind of app we are in, for example, the material app, and then sets all text and other style guidelines according to that. So we can now dump into the code, and I didn't prepare any slides because I think it's more educational if we browse the code together instead of just talking about it on a slide that no one will read anyway. So I will try. The resolution is a bit weird, but we will make it. So first things first, we have a lot of files on the in the file explorer. One of the most important ones is the pubspec.yaml. This file contains every meta information about your app and all of its dependencies. That means there is the name defined that the app will get in the App Store. There you can do your version control. If it's a package, you can specify that it's a package. And you have all meta stuff, as I already said, like dependencies. So just to demonstrate how easy it is to actually add a dependency, I will do it. So there is a repository called pub.dev. I hope the internet is somewhat fast. And there you can just browse for packages you need. For example, if you need to make HTTP calls, you look for the HTTP package and you find it. There is actually another one, but for this demonstration, it's enough. And you just copy the line into your pubspec file. And it's done. And I can use my HTTP in my code. You define assets as well here. So if you have some images you want to display and package it together with your app, you would include them in this file as well. Per default, there are a lot of comments, and there is even a VS Code extension that removes all those comments for you because they are massively. But I didn't install it because you need to do it once. So, but the comments actually explain you how to do everything correctly. So I think it's quite nice of Flutter to do that. Then you have some files you never need to touch. Your README file for your repository. And for every platform you build you have one folder that basically resembles the native code of that platform. So for example, if you have Android, this folder would be your very native Android app and contains everything you know from a typical Android project. So if I go into app, you have the manifest files where you can define all your Android permissions and stuff like that. So you can fine-tune them if they derive from deviate from the global settings. Or if you need, let's say you need a permission for something, you would still need them. You would still need to add them natively. Sorry. You have another folder for iOS and the third one for web, but you basically never need to touch them unless a package tells you in its setup to do so. For example, for the HTTP package we just added, we theoretically needed to add the internet permission to all platforms we want to build because Android or Apple is quite picky if you don't add them. In the lib folder, all your Dart code comes into, and the one thing Dart tells you to do, or Flutter tells you to do, you need to have a main file. So main.dart contains a function main, and this function just starts up your app, and everything else belongs to you. So you don't need to follow some weird guidelines out of the box, which can be a curse and a blessing, because on the one hand, you don't need to jump through hoops in order to get a Hello World app. But on the other hand, you can really mess your code up if you do stuff wrong. Then you have these classes. You can actually define multiple classes per file, different to Java. And as I said, everything is a widget. Even the whole app is in itself a widget. And class just extends this stateless widget. And what this stateless widget tells you, you need to override the build method. And the build method is responsible for telling Flutter what actually needs to be displayed. You get in a build context. This build context basically just contains meta information about where your widget belongs into this widget tree I already talked about. In our case, we return, as I previously said, the material app for standard styling. We can define a theme. In our case, we just tell it that we like blue very much because it's Flutter's signature color in their logo. So all primary colors in the app will be blue out of the box. And secondary colors will be chosen that everything matches. That's what I meant when I say you don't have to be a designer to work with Flutter. And our first page in this material app will be my home page. And my home page is, in this case, a stateful widget that requires us to override a create state method, which is the thing that actually holds our user data. And the state itself has a build method again. So the state method basically is a stateless widget with a build method that is mutable. That's what I want to say. So in our case, we have a counter. No, in our case, we have a counter, which represents the number we see on the screen later. we have a method that increments this counter, and this is the method I was This is the method I was talking about earlier. This set state basically just invokes Flutter's build pipeline that triggers the rebuild each time the number is increased. Otherwise, the number would increase, but we wouldn't see it, which can be a use case as well. And the build method itself returns the scaffold. And this is a very common type that the material app is in one part of the widget, and the scaffold is defined each time it is needed, because the scaffold often changes. It holds a lot of stuff like the app bar, floating action buttons, color information and stuff like that, which could change, and the material app typically does not change. So we have the app bar, which was the top part of the widget we saw earlier. And in the body, we have a center, which does the same as the center tag in HTML. It basically centers whatever you pass into it. A column, because we want to have two things right below each other. And in this column, we first have the text, which says you have pushed the button this many times, and the number. The scaffold already also provides a placeholder for the floating action button, because it's in the material design. The floating action button is on the bottom right usually, and provides some stuff like add something, do something that's really often invoked. And this floating action button calls this increment counter method. So if I go to the simulator, which is far too big for this resolution, that's an iPhone emulator, because that's what was easiest to install on this MacBook. If I just say Flutter run, it will build the app in the background for me and then start it. Yes, when we start it, we can see the exact thing that's displayed now. That's all the button. That's all the elements we just saw. The app bar is colored in blue, because blue was the primary color we selected. The font itself is white, because that's what Flutter chose as a good complementary color for text. If we chose a very light color, Flutter would probably choose a darker color for the text, such that everything looks good in the end. And if we press this button, we see the number increasing. Hooray. So I wanted to add a feature live, but I think I'm a bit over time. So we just go on with the with the presentation. So I talked a lot about why you should use Flutter and why it's the best thing in the world for everyone all times. Now a few words about when you probably won't use Flutter. So if you want to have a high performance application where every millisecond matters, then you would step back in using Flutter, because it's kind of a layer over the native layer, but not quite. You get some performance issues if you have really high requirements. If you want to have multi-threaded stuff, like you compress images on a second thread and do stuff like that, you probably don't want to use Flutter as well, because Dart supports threads. They are called isolates, but they do not allow you to make native calls to the underlying operating system, so they are kind of useless for stuff that's not natively coded in Dart. If you want to have a non-standard UI, you can do that, actually, but it's very hard for you, because each UI framework is somewhere on a point between we give you some helping stuff to get started to we give you very much everything you need in pre-built components. So basically like Tailwind versus Bootstrap in web development. And Flutter is very much on the we give you everything you need side of this deal. So if you want to have something that's a little bit different to material design, you probably have to build everything from scratch, or hope that one other person already did it for you. If you only want to deploy for one platform and you know that beforehand, I would probably stick with native development there, because that is still one tiny bit better in terms of performance and in terms of features you will get, because I have got some problems, for example, accessing the camera while being on the web. I had to jump through a lot of hoops to be able to do that. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And if you don't know what tech you want to go into as your first tech, I won't recommend Flutter for you because no one is hiring Flutter developers. So each time I was at an interview, I said, I like Flutter. And it was, what's Flutter? So there I would go something more mainstream, like, I don't know, something JS, Vue, React, you name it. And as a final part of the presentation, I want to show you 3 cool packages some other people already developed that look very much, and I don't have to show anything behind it, so I can just point to them. So the first one is FLChart, which provides you the possibility to draw very nice looking charts with very minimum effort in your application. So like here you have okay, you can see the link on the bottom. Nice. Like here you have a radar chart or a chart that switches modes when you hover over different elements. So it's very sophisticated. And you don't have to do anything besides importing the library and make one call to this engine. So what more do you want as a non-designer techniker? The second package is another flush bar. It does everything it says on the title. It shows you a nice little message with a nice little animation with some content you might need. So for example, you are successfully registered, or the input was not correct, or like on the middle, you killed the giant monster in the city, congratulations. So, and this package gives you more than the standard one, so because you can customize it very highly. And the final one is intro slider. Like apps like these meditation apps often do, get into the right mindset, sit down, become calm and something. So each time you have a step-by-step onboarding or a tutorial, you could use those ones. So it's pretty nice what you can do with Flutter. I didn't prepare, thank you for your attention, slide, so I will just scroll back to the beginning. Thank you for your attention. Do we have time for questions? Are there any questions? Okay.
How's the debugger integration? Can you like set a breakpoint and debug on every platform you're running the application, or?
Yes. So you can either do it via your IDE and do everything you know from like Java, where you set a breakpoint or a conditional breakpoint and then step by step through your application. But you get also, I think you can see it in the Visual Studio down here. You get also a link to an observer that gives you more information about your current app state. So you see the tree of widgets in a readable format and stuff like that, and its internal state. So the debugging is actually quite nice.
Looks great. How would you differentiate the different I don't know, UI guidelines for the different platforms? Because I know that Apple users are quite picky on their user experience. Also, Android users are. In putting an Android material app like you just showed on the iPhone, I think they're just gonna lynch you.
There you can. There it highly depends on your code architecture. So you can use hexagonal architecture, maybe not. But if you separate the application logic from the presentation layer, as you should do anyway, you can differentiate that as well. You can access the current platform via a built-in class. I forgot the name. It's platform, I think. And then you can do checks like, is Android, is iOS, if you need to differentiate. Or you build agnostic, I think the term is agnostic, components that do that by themselves. So basically the caller just uses the component, and the component checks, am I on Android, am I on iOS, and reacts accordingly.
But it's still in Dart.
Yes. Yes?
For the GUI design, do you have like a drag and drop tool, like I put a button there, a text there, or is everything from a palette and you take it from there?
There is a tool that's called, I think, Adobe XD that offers an export service to Dart. But what I heard, so I never used it because just prototyping that was for me faster. But I heard that there is an exporter which exports Adobe XD files into that, but I think the quality isn't great. So I don't think there is one yet. But there are a few in the making, so I'm not up to date with that because I don't use them. Yes?
How old is Flutter? When was it conceived?
I would have to Google it. But it's very young, so we're currently at Flutter 3. It came out a few days ago. I think it's 5 to 8 years, maybe a bit longer. So very recent, actually.
And regarding the life cycle, so do you have like stuff that you have developed like 2 years ago? Can you migrate it to the next, I don't know,
Flutter
version or?
It's a nice thing that you asked that because I wanted to show it, but because of time pressure, I couldn't. Flutter 2 got a very nice feature, actually Dart, that's called null safety. It's something that bothers me in Java up to this day, that everything can be null or not. And Flutter 2 introduced null safety. It's what's written here, actually, that this app is running without null safety. And that was a breaking feature for a lot of apps because it changed something in the syntax, and older apps, if you just set null safety to true, wouldn't work anymore. But the Flutter team actually set up a migration tool, which is web-based, which showed you every occurrence of null safety that was invalid, and you could via this should have null safety, this shouldn't, basically iterate over every change, and theoretically it should work then. So I used it myself because I created a pen and paper management tool as my passion project, which was older than Flutter 2, and we migrated it, and that was done in about a week with this tool. So it was actually quite pleasant because I was expecting to move everything file by file into a new project, which would be very cumbersome, but the Flutter devs saved us. Yes?
I would have two questions. One would be, how do you think Flutter stacks up against Compose? I mean, they are both developed by Google, if I'm not mistaken, and they are like competitive, but both
I cannot answer that question because I neither used Compose nor heard about it before your question. Sorry.
So you haven't been to the second to last Lakeside Talk?
No, this is my first one.
The other question was actually, okay, can you use Dart for different things than Flutter?
Yes. There is even, for example, if you want to go full stack with Dart, there's a backend framework that's called Aqueduct. I personally never used it because my backend adapter backend framework is Java Spring. But I think people can do full stack with just Dart. So it does everything on a basic level you want to have in your backend, like writing to the database, taking requests, and all the good stuff.
Okay, one more question? No? Okay. Then, thank you again. And as is usual with the Lakeside Talks, I would like to have all speakers quickly up here again, if that's all right.
And someone gets this adapter back.
Yes. Guys, as a small thank you for joining, we have Google rights with a Lakeside Tech event branded, not blanket, now I'm blanking. Towel? Towel, thank you very much. It's a beach towel. It's a beach towel. So, thank you again for joining. I hope you all had fun, you learned something. There's still time to talk to the speakers or ask them questions that you didn't ask before or that you come up with now. But I'm also happy to announce that now it's time for the barbecue. We had a slight issue with the wind, so please get your meat directly at the grill. other than that, have some drinks, have some barbecue, and have some nice time networking. I'll be here for long, so enjoy.
Awesome.